Chapter 1. A Real Miracle. Jeff Moore was a high school student in my church, a dark-haired, good-looking teenager with paper-white skin and a slight build. He was well-liked, polite, quiet but friendly. He never drew attention to himself or his problem. Jeff had lost the use of his feet. They hurt so much that they would no longer carry his weight. He came to church in a wheelchair. I didn't know Jeff or his family then, but I often saw them at morning worship. I attend a Presbyterian church with about 600 members. It is a warm, Bible-believing, multi-generational church that is a little traditional, but tries to be flexible. We sing hymns with an organ, but we also try to bridge the gap between generations by using contemporary songs with a band. Jeff's mother, Sherry, was one of a handful of worship leaders very visibly singing in the choir at the front of the church. Jeff was visible because he was the only young person in a wheelchair. Every week his father wheeled him into church. It could not have been easy to come to church that way, and their faces showed the strain, I thought. Yet Jeff was always present with his parents and his two younger brothers. It made me sad to see this healthy young man so crippled. It brought mystification, too. I had never heard of a young person whose feet hurt so much he couldn't walk. Why couldn't the doctors figure it out? Somebody told me his case baffled them. Then one Sunday morning, our pastor announced that Jeff's mother had something to share. Sherry stepped out of the choir and quietly said that Jeff had been healed. He had gone to a service at a church in another city, several hours away, and after healing prayer, he stepped out of his wheelchair. His pain was completely gone. He could walk. He could run. God had healed him, his mother said. I heard several spontaneous expressions of praise, 2 or 3 exclamations of, "Praise the Lord!" Later in the service, our pastor prayed and thanked God for what he had done for Jeff. But truthfully, the response was restrained. No whooping, no delirious thanks, and not a lot of buzz afterward. Maybe, and here I might be projecting my own feelings, there was some uncertainty as to how we should react. I heard that Jeff's family was disappointed by the response. They had been bubbling over with joy, but they weren't met with the same emotions. Why the restraint? I'm guessing at what others felt, because there wasn't any public discussion. I know what I felt, and I suspect it was typical. I was very glad at Jeff's news, but I was hesitant to put too much weight on it. I didn't know what had caused Jeff's problem, but it seemed possible it was psychosomatic. The mind is a very tricky thing. What if we whooped it up over a miracle and then discovered that the problem came back days or weeks later? That wouldn't put God in a very good light. It wouldn't build anybody's faith. I also worried about Jeff being disappointed. Sometimes people want so much for God to heal them that they convince themselves he has done so. But the problem doesn't really disappear. It comes back, and eventually the hurting person has to face reality. No miracle. Then he or she is left wondering why God put them through such high hopes and disappointment. I witnessed this in college. At a Christian conference, one of my fellow students came to believe that God wanted to heal his poor eyesight. He stood and dramatically announced his conviction, hurling his glasses across the room. Later, he had to retrieve them because his eyes were as bad as ever. Fortunately, the glasses had not broken. I've seen the same thing with people plagued by chronic health issues or mental health struggles. They become convinced God has healed them and tell others so, expecting everybody to praise God, until it's undeniable they are not healed. As it turned out, those fears were misplaced in Jeff's case. Months later, he was bouncing around like any other young man, utterly pain-free. He really was healed. What does that say about those of us who hesitated? Was it a judgment on our lack of faith? I wasn't very happy when I heard the reaction from the pastor at the church where Jeff was healed. He told his congregation about Jeff's healing with great jubilation, as he should have. Then he added, with equal jubilation, a Presbyterian church in the Bay Area had its faith rocked, and his congregation roared. The implications seemed to be that stodgy Presbyterians had a few lessons to learn, as though miracles were a contest, with winning churches and losing churches. That stuck in my craw a bit, but I had to admit I was envious of the pastor's self-assurance. I look to see God answer my prayers, but I'm never sure what God's answer will be. Is this a lack of faith? That's one of the questions I want to probe in this book. In my 60 years, I've seen many people who prayed fervently and didn't see healing. How should I respond to that? I long to see God's life in the world. I want to know where He is at work. I want to cooperate with Him in the way He chooses to operate. I want to walk by His side, working with Him. But I want it to be real, not hyped up fantasy faith. Nearly 3 years after Jeff's healing, I decided I needed to talk to him. Jeff's story had stayed in my mind. Why couldn't a Christian congregation, my congregation, celebrate such a wonderful healing with heart and soul? Why had Jeff received such a muted and mixed response? Also, I wanted to know exactly what had happened to Jeff and his family. Had the healing been complete? In the years since, had pain returned? I found Jeff's number in the church directory, called him up, and explained that I would like to hear his story. Jeff's voice over the phone was hesitant. He said he wasn't sure. I didn't press him. I just emphasized how much I would like to hear about what had happened to him, and asked him to think it over. After I hung up, I wondered, was there something embarrassing that he didn't want to share? Had pain come back to his feet? I hadn't seen him at church lately. It could be because we attended different services, but it could be something more troubling. I had to leave several messages before I reached him again, and this made me wonder even more. But when I finally got through, Jeff agreed to talk. I met him at a local coffee shop and almost didn't recognize him. I remembered him as slight and pale, but he had become tanned and strong. His manner struck me even more. Jeff isn't a talker. He didn't volunteer details about his healing. Truthfully, he wasn't eager to talk about anything that far in the past. He had moved on, and that actually made his story more believable. Jeff was not selling anything. There wasn't a trace of hype in his manner. He was a just-the-facts guy. Apparently, he had been that way even when he was disabled. From what he said, he hadn't worked himself into a fever, praying for healing of his damaged feet. On the contrary, after 5 years of constant medical interventions, 5 separate surgeries, countless doctor's appointments, acupuncture, physical therapy, orthotics, he had just wanted to be left alone. The problem with his feet had snuck up on him gradually. The Moores were an active, adventurous family. They backpacked, they hiked, they took up some kind of outdoor activity virtually every weekend. When Jeff was 9 or 10, he began to complain about his feet when the family went hiking. His parents thought it was his boots. After a family trip to the county fair, Jeff complained that his feet were killing him. His parents thought nothing of it. Who doesn't have hurting feet after walking around the fair all day? When he was 13, Jeff had an accident on his skateboard, but instead of healing, his foot stayed swollen. Eventually, he went to the doctor, who told him he had broken something called a tarsal coalition. Jeff had flat feet, and to make up for the lack of flexibility in his feet, his body had fused together some of the bones. When Jeff fell off his skateboard, the fusion had broken, so the doctors put Jeff in a cast to allow the break to heal. But the bones didn't heal, and the pain continued. The surgeons cut open his foot and put in a titanium peg. The surgery worked as intended. His foot developed an arch. But after a long recuperation, Jeff still felt severe pain. 6 months later, they operated on the other foot, with the same result. Jeff described his story to me. I have a jar at home filled with all the screws they put in and later took out. In the last operation, they cut open my calf and lengthened the muscle, slit my heel, slid it over, and tried to remake my foot. This elaborate surgery required Jeff to spend 6 months in a cast and then relearn how to walk with his altered foot. They succeeded in a way. They really did form perfect arches. I no longer had flat feet, but the pain was still there. I could walk a little, but the more walking I did, the more it hurt, until it was unbearable. By the time I was 17, I was done with it. They wanted to do another surgery, something drastic that would fuse my bones together. But after 5 surgeries and nothing different, I just gave up on it. I went for acupuncture and electrical stimulation, but they didn't help either. I was trying to accept that I was always going to be in a wheelchair. My parents were broken up by it, I think. They never really gave up hoping that I could walk again. I have an aunt whom I've never met who gave money to a church that prayed for me every week. They sent me a card telling me that they had prayed for me. I thought it was kind of odd, to tell you the truth. Nobody else prayed for me that I knew of, and I'm not sure how I would have felt about it if they had offered. I definitely did not believe that healing could happen. I wasn't really mad about it. Some days I was fine. Some days I was just irritable. I wanted to forget about change and deal with what was going to be my life. By that time, Jeff was attending the local junior college, pulling his wheelchair out of the back of his classic Mustang and rolling himself in and out of classes. At an adaptive PE class, he struck up a friendship with another student named Leland, who was also in a wheelchair. Leland was older than Jeff and covered in tattoos. He had lost the use of his legs years before. A very friendly guy, Leland invited Jeff to join a wheelchair basketball team. The first time Jeff attended a practice, he came home elated in a way he had not been for years. He loved the all-out way they played, smashing into each other, even knocking each other out of their wheelchairs. Practice soon became his favorite day of the week. It was great to get physical. When the team entered a tournament in Reading, a 4-hour drive away, Jeff's parents were concerned. Leland had offered to drive, but they didn't know him, and the trip would necessitate staying overnight in a motel. Right, Jeff said to their worries. How many mass murderers do you know who are confined to a wheelchair? Seeing how much it meant to Jeff, they let him go. Jeff found the tournament enjoyable, even though one of his teammates had a terrible seizure and had to be taken away by ambulance. The games wrapped up on a Saturday night. On Sunday morning, Leland suggested to Jeff that they go to a church he knew. Jeff had no objection, so they wheeled their chairs into a sprawling structure known as Bethel Church. Jeff sat through the service and wasn't particularly struck by it. Jeff described it like this. After the service, they invited people who wanted prayer to come forward. Leland wanted us both to go. I wouldn't have done it without his urging. I was not really hoping for anything, but I wheeled down to the front because Leland urged me. 2 young people came up to us and prayed for us, laying hands on us. We weren't the center of attention. Other people were praying nearby. I didn't feel anything while they prayed, and I really didn't think anything had happened. Then one of them said, "Jeff, stand up." I did stand up. That was nothing special. I could always stand. I waited for the pain to start, as it always did, but this time it didn't. I took a few steps. No pain. Somebody suggested I should do something that would really hurt. I walked up on the stage, 4 feet high, and jumped to the ground. That should have been excruciating, but there was no pain. None. From that moment, I've never had another ounce of pain in my feet. I was in shock. Most people had already left the church, but we hung around for a while, talking to people. Jeff had spoken to me in a very matter-of-fact voice, but at this moment his eyes went into space. His words came out quietly and dreamily. I'll always remember pushing my wheelchair down the aisle and out of that church. Jeff didn't call his parents. They had no idea what had happened when he reached home that afternoon. "Mom, Dad, guess what?" he said, getting out of the car. "My feet aren't hurting." As she absorbed the news, his mom began to cry. Typical of Jeff, he didn't want to talk about it. He grabbed his skateboard. He hadn't used it in years, but he still remembered how. Jeff's feet were like new, but his legs were the same old legs. He hadn't used them for years, and the muscles had atrophied. Skateboarding soon wore him out. Walking was hard. His legs were so sore he had to use crutches for several days. When he went to class on Monday, everybody wanted to know what had happened to him. All the years he had been in a wheelchair, nobody ever asked questions. Now he told the story over and over again. He said, "The reactions were mixed. I could tell that some people just didn't believe me. Others were amazed. At church, reactions were also mixed. Many people were overjoyed. All my friends thought it was just awesome. But I could tell a lot of people didn't know what to think." Jeff didn't begrudge anybody their doubts. If it had been reversed, I would have been the same way.